There's a specific apology almost every super empath eventually receives, one that sounds, on the surface, exactly like the accountability she once spent years hoping to hear. The words are right, the tone often sounds genuinely regretful. And yet something in her, something she's earned through considerable pain, refuses to accept it as real, regardless of how convincingly it's delivered or how much she might once have craved exactly these words. Today, we're going to trace exactly what this specific apology consists of, why it fails to land no matter how sincere it sounds, and why a healed super empath's refusal to accept it represents wisdom rather than bitterness or continued resentment. Let's start with defining precisely what this apology actually is, because the distinction matters enormously for understanding why she rejects it, while remaining genuinely, completely open to different kinds of acknowledgement that might arrive in its place. The apology she will never accept, one offered specifically to avoid consequence, rather than one offered because genuine understanding of harm has actually developed. This distinction requires careful examination, because from the outside, these two categories of apology often sound nearly identical. Both might include the same words: "I'm sorry. I know I hurt you. I understand this caused real damage." What separates them isn't the language used, but something considerably more specific worth tracing carefully: the timing, the context, and what actually happens immediately before and after the apology is delivered. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the technique that produces the words "I'm sorry" without producing genuine accountability. A super empath who has genuinely healed, who has developed the discernment this entire series has examined extensively, has typically encountered enough of these narrow, strategically timed apologies to recognize their specific signature immediately, regardless of how sincere they might sound in isolation. Here's what this signature actually looks like, and understanding it in detail explains why she's developed such reliable immunity to it. The consequence avoidance apology arrives specifically when something is genuinely at stake for him: the relationship's continuation, his reputation among people whose opinion matters to him, a legal or professional consequence he's genuinely trying to avoid. It rarely arrives during periods of genuine safety, when no immediate cost hangs over the interaction. This timing alone provides significant information because genuine remorse, the kind that develops through authentic reflection rather than strategic calculation, doesn't typically arrive precisely when it's most convenient and most likely to prevent an unwanted outcome. Here's the second element of this specific signature, one that requires considerably more careful observation to identify. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the four signs revealing genuine private guilt: the preemptive counteraccusation, the uncharacteristic generosity, the anxious information gathering. A consequence avoidance apology typically arrives without these preceding signals, without the messy, uncomfortable, often contradictory behavior that tends to accompany genuine internal reckoning. Instead, it arrives polished, prepared, delivered with a fluency that suggests rehearsal rather than the halting, imperfect quality that usually characterizes genuine emotional processing happening in real time. Here's the third and perhaps most revealing element of this signature: what happens immediately after the apology is delivered, regardless of how you respond to it. A genuine apology, even an imperfect one, typically remains stable regardless of whether it succeeds in producing the specific outcome he was hoping for. If you don't immediately reconcile, if you remain skeptical, if the apology doesn't produce the relief or the reconciliation he was seeking, genuine remorse tends to persist anyway, because it was never actually contingent on producing a specific result. Consequence avoidance apology, by contrast, often reveals itself precisely in this aftermath. If it doesn't produce the desired outcome quickly, it frequently shifts, sometimes rapidly, back toward the defensive patterns we've traced throughout this entire series, revealing that the apology was always instrumental rather than genuine, a means toward a specific end rather than authentic acknowledgement offered regardless of what followed. Here's why a healed super empath, specifically, more reliably than almost anyone else, develops the capacity to recognize this signature immediately, often within moments of receiving it. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the specific kind of perception that develops through genuine healing. The capacity to detect incongruence between performance and authenticity that we discussed extensively in our conversation about the forbidden gift of the solitary empath. This same perceptual sophistication, developed through painful necessity throughout her own healing journey, extends directly into her capacity to distinguish strategic apology from genuine reckoning, often faster and more reliably than people who haven't developed this specific discernment through comparable experience. This is worth understanding as a genuine skill, hard-won through real pain, rather than as cynicism or an inability to believe in the possibility of genuine change. She's not rejecting the concept of authentic remorse itself. She's specifically, reliably identifying its absence in this particular instance, based on patterns she's learned to recognize with considerable accuracy through her own extensive, painful experience. Let's examine what this rejection actually looks like in practice, and why understanding it matters considerably more than simply cataloging the signature we traced in the first part of this conversation, because the actual response deserves careful examination on its own terms. Here's what rejecting this specific apology typically does not look like, and this distinction matters enormously for understanding what genuine, healed discernment actually produces. It doesn't look like dramatic confrontation, doesn't look like listing every reason the apology fails to convince her, doesn't look like an emotional outburst designed to communicate exactly how thoroughly she recognizes the manipulation embedded in the timing and delivery. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about how genuine, calm response tends to be considerably more powerful than dramatic reaction. Her rejection of this specific apology typically manifests as something quieter and considerably more devastating to the person offering it. Simple, unmoved acknowledgement that offers no reward whatsoever for the strategic timing and careful delivery that clearly required considerable effort to construct. This might sound like, "I hear you," delivered without any of the relief or warmth he was likely hoping to produce. It might look like continuing whatever boundary or consequence the apology was specifically designed to prevent, exactly as though the apology had never been offered at all. This response, precisely because it withholds the specific reward his strategic apology was constructed to secure, often produces genuine confusion and genuine distress in someone accustomed to this particular tactic working, at least occasionally, with people less developed in their capacity to distinguish strategic timing from genuine reflection. Here's what's crucial to understand about why this specific response, calm, unmoved acknowledgement, without the reward the apology was seeking, represents wisdom rather than bitterness. A distinction worth examining carefully because it addresses a common misunderstanding about what this rejection actually signifies. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the difference between forgiveness and restored access, examined extensively in our conversation about disrespect that should never be forgiven. A super empath's rejection of this specific apology doesn't necessarily indicate permanent, unresolved anger or genuine bitterness toward the person offering it. It indicates something more precise. Accurate recognition that this particular apology, in this particular moment, doesn't actually represent the genuine accountability that would warrant a different response. This means her rejection remains genuinely open to revision if circumstances actually genuinely change. Remember what we discussed extensively throughout our conversation about the technique that produces apology-shaped words. The crucial distinction between narrow, isolated acknowledgement and comprehensive, sustained accountability demonstrated through consistent behavior over meaningful time. If the same person eventually offers something different, not simply another strategically timed apology, but sustained, demonstrated change that persists regardless of whether it produces the specific reconciliation he might be hoping for, her discernment remains genuinely capable of recognizing this difference and responding accordingly. What she rejects specifically is the strategic, consequence-driven version we've traced throughout today's conversation, not the theoretical possibility of genuine accountability ever existing at all. Here's something worth understanding about why this specific rejection often produces more lasting effect than any dramatic confrontation could achieve, connecting to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about betraying a super empath permanently. Remember everything we discussed about how heavily narcissistic psychology depends on successfully managing the narrative around specific incidents, extracting some form of resolution that allows the discomfort of the moment to be filed away and forgotten. Her calm, unmoved rejection denies exactly this resolution. The apology remains, in his own internal experience, genuinely unresolved, not dramatically rejected in a way that would provide at least some form of closure through conflict, but simply left hanging, acknowledged without being accepted, creating exactly the kind of ongoing, unresolved discomfort we traced extensively in our conversation about the specific sentence that reveals genuine self-trust. Here's what's worth understanding about the specific emotional experience this creates for her, because it's genuinely different from what dramatic confrontation would produce. And understanding this difference matters for anyone currently developing this same capacity in their own healing journey. Rejecting a strategic apology through calm, unmoved acknowledgement doesn't typically produce the cathartic release that dramatic confrontation might provide. It requires holding genuine discomfort, the discomfort of witnessing someone attempt manipulation and choosing not to reward it, even when part of her might genuinely wish the apology were real, even when some part of her might genuinely want to believe that this time, finally, the accountability she once hoped for has actually arrived. This is worth naming directly because it reveals something important about the genuine difficulty embedded in this specific capacity, one that shouldn't be romanticized as effortless wisdom simply because it looks calm and controlled from the outside. Recognizing and rejecting a strategic apology, even when every recognition signal we've traced throughout this conversation points clearly toward its inauthenticity, still requires holding genuine grief. Grief for the accountability she likely, understandably wanted to receive. Grief for the reconciliation that would have been so much easier to simply accept. Grief that her own hard-won discernment prevents her from taking the easier, more immediately comforting path of believing something her accumulated experience has taught her not to trust. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward, and it's worth being direct about it, rather than leaving this conversation as simply an examination of a specific rejection pattern without addressing what genuinely matters most, what this capacity actually costs, what it protects, and how to hold it in a way that serves your continued life rather than hardening into something that closes you off from genuine connection altogether. The first thing worth understanding clearly is something we touched on, but deserves direct emphasis here. This specific rejection, however wise and however protective, doesn't come without genuine cost, and pretending otherwise misrepresents what this capacity actually requires to maintain. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the grief embedded in accurate perception, the way seeing clearly sometimes means giving up the comfort of believing something easier, something that would require less discernment and less painful accuracy. Every time a healed super empath recognizes and rejects a strategic apology, she's simultaneously accomplishing something protective and experiencing something genuinely difficult. The loss, once again, of the reconciliation and accountability she likely, understandably still wishes were genuinely available to her. This matters because it protects against a specific misunderstanding of what genuine healing actually produces. Healing doesn't eliminate the wish for genuine accountability, doesn't eliminate the part of her that would genuinely prefer the apology be real, doesn't produce someone who no longer cares whether reconciliation is possible. What it produces instead is the discernment to distinguish accurately between what's genuinely available and what merely resembles it, combined with the strength to act according to that accurate discernment even when a different, easier response might feel more immediately comforting in the moment. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how this specific capacity extends beyond this one relationship into every future interaction where someone might attempt this same strategic apology pattern. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about pattern recognition serving as protective wisdom moving forward, extending far beyond the specific relationship where it was originally developed. Once you've genuinely developed the capacity to recognize the signature of consequence avoidance apology, the strategic timing, the polished delivery lacking the messier signs of genuine internal reckoning, the shift back toward defensiveness when the desired outcome doesn't immediately materialize. This recognition doesn't require rebuilding from scratch with each new person who might attempt this pattern. It becomes part of your permanent, transferable discernment, protecting you across every future relationship where someone might eventually attempt exactly this specific manipulation. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that addresses a specific concern worth examining directly. Does this capacity risk making you unable to ever accept genuine apology, even when it eventually actually arrives? This question deserves careful, honest examination because the answer matters enormously for ensuring this hard-won discernment protects you without simultaneously closing you off from the genuine connection and genuine reconciliation that remains in principle possible with people who haven't demonstrated the specific pattern we've traced throughout today's conversation. Remember everything we've discussed throughout this entire series about the distinction between healthy discernment and unhealthy indiscriminate guardedness. Genuine, healed discernment doesn't reject all apology categorically. It rejects specifically the pattern we've traced today, remaining genuinely open to the different pattern that genuine remorse actually produces. The messier, less strategically timed, more consistently sustained acknowledgement that persists regardless of whether it produces the specific outcome someone might be hoping for. If you notice yourself rejecting every single apology you ever receive, regardless of its specific pattern or timing, this deserves the same honest self-examination we discussed extensively in our conversation about over-applying frameworks in ways that damage genuinely healthy relationships. Healed discernment is precise, not indiscriminate, and maintaining this precision requires ongoing, honest evaluation of each specific instance rather than a blanket, permanent rejection of all future apology, regardless of its actual quality. Here's the fourth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. The apology a super empath will never accept isn't apology itself. It's the specific, strategic, consequence-driven version we've traced throughout today's discussion, one she's learned to recognize through considerable painful experience, one that fails to meet the standard genuine accountability actually requires. This rejection, however difficult to maintain in the moment, however much genuine grief it might require holding alongside it, represents something worth understanding clearly as protection rather than bitterness. The refusal to let hard-won discernment be overridden by the understandable human wish that this particular instance might finally, genuinely be different. If you recognize this specific capacity developing in your own life, understand exactly what you're protecting through it. Not simply your own immediate comfort, though that matters too. Something more fundamental. Your own accurate perception of reality, maintained even when a less accurate, more comfortable alternative would feel considerably easier to accept in the moment. This discernment, hard won through everything this entire series has traced, remains one of the most valuable protections available to you, precisely because it doesn't require you to become cynical about the theoretical possibility of genuine change. It simply requires you to hold accurately, precisely, the difference between what genuine change actually looks like and what merely strategically resembles it, closely enough to almost, but never quite, pass for the real thing. Closely enough to almost, but never quite, pass for the real thing. There's one more consideration worth adding here, because it addresses something practical many people wonder about once they've absorbed this entire conversation. What do you actually say in the moment when you recognize this specific pattern unfolding, but don't want to launch into a full explanation of everything we've traced throughout this discussion? Remember everything we've established about how calm, brief response tends to be considerably more powerful than elaborate justification. You don't owe anyone a detailed breakdown of exactly why you've identified their apology as strategic rather than genuine. A simple, honest acknowledgement, "I hear that you're sorry," followed by continued adherence to whatever boundary or consequence the apology was hoping to prevent, communicates everything necessary without requiring you to defend or explain your own accurate perception to someone whose entire pattern has already demonstrated they're unlikely to genuinely receive that explanation anyway. Here's something worth understanding about a related situation many people encounter. What happens when other people in your life, friends, family members, mutual connections, witness this apology and encourage you to accept it, genuinely believing, based on their more limited view of the situation, that it sounds sincere and that reconciliation seems reasonable? This deserves direct address because it touches something we've traced throughout this entire series about how isolating genuine discernment can sometimes feel, particularly when people without your specific hard-won experience genuinely, kindly encourage you toward a response that your own accurate perception has already ruled out. Remember everything we've discussed throughout this series about not requiring external validation in order to trust your own accurate perception. You're not obligated to convince well-meaning friends or family members of the specific signature you've learned to recognize, particularly if explaining it in full detail feels exhausting or unlikely to actually change their view. A simple response: "I appreciate that you want this to work out, but I've learned to trust my own read on this specific situation," protects your own boundary without requiring you to justify or defend the considerable painful work that produced your current discernment. Here's a final thought worth carrying forward from everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. The capacity to recognize and reject this specific apology represents one of the clearest, most practical demonstrations of everything this entire series has examined about genuine healing. It's not abstract. It's not simply theoretical understanding of narcissistic psychology. It's a specific, real-time skill that gets tested repeatedly in actual moments where the pull toward easier, more comfortable acceptance genuinely competes against hard-won accuracy about what's actually being offered. Every time you successfully navigate this specific moment, recognizing the strategic timing, noticing the absence of the messier signs that typically accompany genuine reckoning, holding your own boundary, regardless of how polished or sincere the delivery sounds, You're not simply protecting yourself from one specific manipulation attempt. You're actively reinforcing the entire foundation of trust in your own perception that this whole series has traced as the ultimate goal of genuine healing. This reinforcement matters considerably more than any single interaction because it continues building your capacity to navigate every future situation where someone might attempt something similar. Whether that person resembles the specific narcissistic pattern this series has examined extensively, or whether it's simply an ordinary person in an ordinary relationship, attempting the same basic strategy of apology as avoidance rather than apology as genuine accountability. This is ultimately what makes this specific capacity so valuable, extending far beyond any single relationship or any single apology you might ever receive. You've learned something that protects you everywhere, permanently, regardless of who eventually attempts this same pattern, in whatever context it might eventually arise throughout the rest of your life.